Thank you all very much for coming along this evening to the Institute of Historical Research, Transport and Mobility History seminar series. My name is Mike Esbester. I'm one of the co-conveners, and Charlotte Matheson is out there as well, another of the co-conveners. You're all very welcome in the room in real life and online in real life, but just not here. This is one of this year's series of talks which are all loosely themed around railways and railed mobility, thinking about the current Railway 200 stuff that's going on, about which I will say no more because it's a very loose connection. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I will let you know that the next session will be on the 1st of May. We'll be looking at railway archives, hidden gems and well-known treasures. We run a regular session, Ask the Archivist, where we are working with our archival colleagues to get them in to talk about what they've got in their holdings, but also how we can use them and so on. So I'm delighted to say we'll have Jessica Carlson from the National Archives, Alison Kay from the National Railway Museum, and Tamara Thornhill, one of our other co-conveners from Transport for London, to lead that session. The booking isn't yet available, but will be soon, so please keep an eye on the IHR website. So that's your fair notice on that one. Now over to this evening, and I'm delighted to introduce Will Tullett, who is a senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of York. And some of you may wonder what's going on given the subject and title of this evening's talk, but all will become clear because he does do a lot more than, in inverted commas, just early modern history. Particularly interested in public, embodied, environmental and sensory history. Many of these are going to be tied together this evening, particularly working on smell, history and heritage. So we're going to see that crossover tonight with some of those embodied and environmental aspects, I think. You have recently led Horizon 2020 funded ODI Europa project, which looked fascinating, and is it finished, the Royal Society of Edinburgh?
Yeah, so this paper comes from the Royal Society of Edinburgh funded project, The Smell of Scotland, by Zule Huang at the University of Edinburgh.
Magnificent, thank you very much. And your most recent book, The Smell of the Past, is open access, available through Bloomsbury, came out in 2023. So I'm going to hand over, once I've got the slides up and hopefully shared, and Charlotte, if I do manage to share these slides correctly, please will you just shout out and let me know. This is the bit that I'm most twitchy about. Is it doing anything? Can you see that? Oh yeah, sorry, present.
Yeah, all good.
I'm really surprised.
Yeah, you're quite right. You're going to do it. Is it doing it? It is doing it. Right, okay, fine. Okay, this is good. Right, okay, I'm going to shuffle out of the way and hand over to Will. So
which way do you want to shuffle?
I'll go that way.
Go that way? Okay.
Thank you, Will.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody in the room and online. You are just as real as we are. And thank you for attending. So, yeah, I'm just going to go straight into the paper because I've got a lot to cover. And at some point, I will look over and I will say, please, can you shut up? And I will have to finish. So we've got a lot to go through. So in 2022, a thread appeared on the Glasgow subreddit in which a user inquired why the Buchanan Street Underground station on the city subway system always smelled of farts. They added that they were not sure if it's piped in or if they employ someone to keep it topped up, but it's always the same brand. A variety of explanations followed from helpful users, perhaps riffing on Charles Babbage's 1837 claim that the air itself was one vast library of all that humans have said and done. One respondent suggested that, I'm pretty sure they're left over from the original builders. 19th century diets produced farts that were slightly heavier than air, so they never made their way to the surface and they just get pulled around the tunnels in the slipstreams from trains. This thread exemplifies a general trend that one finds on contemporary social media and online forums, in which inquisitive or confused locals seek out explanations for odours that are surprising or unfamiliar. A further rummage through the Glasgow subreddit will also find, alongside several other posts inquiring about the subway's distinctive odour, threads titled Poo Smell West End, Why does Glasgow sometimes randomly smell of shite? Why is there a burning smell near the university? And my favourite, purely for the specificity involved, why does the M74 near Brother Glen smell of spicy sausage pasta farts? In modern cities, synthetic odours, a confusion of chemicals, and industrial and automobile pollution combine in an abstract fug. When ordinary people who have not trained their nose to discriminate between such scents encounter those odours in ways that are not consistent with the rhythms of their everyday smellscape, they're left bemused and seek out answers. It's no accident that the inquiry on Reddit about the Glasgow subway smell appeared after the COVID pandemic. Social distancing and masking regulations were relaxed in late 2021 and early 2022. Perhaps some Glaswegians previously habituated to the subway's peculiar odour were re-experiencing the smell afresh. Despite the humorous, feces-focused nature of many such inquiries, we can, and should take such remarks seriously. They are minor examples of what Nicholas Shapiro has termed the chemical sublime, minor enfeebling encounters that lead to a recognition of one's chemical vulnerability to the environment that in turn stir people to consideration and potential intervention in the atmospheres that they breathe. However, in the thread discussing the Glasgow subway scent, something additional was happening. A large number of more earnest respondents noted that the smell had always been there. They offered historical explanations that included the peculiar mix of minerals and bacteria in the soil, the pollution in the groundwater from Glasgow's historical chemical industries, and the ozone from the electrics. This was joined by expressions of recognition and appreciation from Glaswegians that indicated that the smell was well known and indeed even liked by some. The smell of Glasgow subway was unique, it was historic, and it was therefore, we might suggest, a heritage smell. This paper brings together both past and present smell witnesses to trace the history of the Glasgow subway's distinctive and infamous odour, or perhaps, more properly, odours plural. This was a smell that continues to fascinate the users of the Metro today, as news stories and threads on social media sites illustrate. The mix of odours that have characterised and continue to characterise Glasgow's clockwork orange are an interesting mix of the ubiquitous scents of the modern city, and the unique smells lead us to think about scent as a form of heritage that might be worth preserving. So to give you some kind of broader context of the scholarship here on smell, with which some members of the seminar might be less familiar, I think. The idea that smells might be a form of heritage deserving of identification, analysis, and preservation is relatively new. Despite smell history receiving its first academic treatments in the 80s and 90s, courtesy of Alain Corbin's History of Smell in 18th and 19th Century France, The Foul and the Fragrance, and David Howes and Constance Classen's more wide-ranging book on the history and anthropology of smell, Aroma, it was only in the first decade of the 2000s, really, that heritage scholars began to grapple with scent fully. In 2004, an edited volume published by the International Museum of Perfumery in Grasse asked what olfactory heritage was, whether it could be transmitted across generations, and what role perfumery might play in that process. And the pursuit from then on of these questions has opened up a can of heritage policy flavoured worms. Rosapel Boswell, whose 2008 article on fragrance in Zanzibar was an early attempt to advocate for scent as heritage, noted that smell challenged many of UNESCO's divisions of heritage into the tangible, e.g. monuments and buildings, and intangible, things like music and folklore and artisanal practices. The temporal and spatial dynamism of smell, a phenomenon equal parts perception and materiality, has made it difficult to classify, preserve and monitor in the fashion that UNESCO and other policy bodies demand. In the UK, smells, especially industrial and transport smells, have often sat uneasily within a national authorised heritage discourse identified by Laura Jane Smith that values material authenticity, monumentality and aesthetics while stressing a positive grand national story. Subsequent scholarship on smell and heritage has tended to place emphasis either a bit more on the materiality side of things or a bit more on the perception side of things. So in the former case, we could point to the heritage science approach developed by Cecilia Benbibre that utilises the methods of analytical chemistry in tandem with the social sciences to identify and extract the heritage smells of objects and spaces. For an example of the latter, the more perception-orientated approach, we could turn to Lauren Davis's work using oral histories and smell walks to trace the smellscapes of Istanbul's spice markets. I'm just going to admit somebody to the room so that more people can experience the paper. A body of work has also begun to emerge on the deliberate deployment of smell, often crafted with the help of perfumers and sensory consultants within museum and heritage spaces, which has highlighted the immense power that smell has to connect audiences with the past, encourage conversations between visitors, and allow audiences to understand museum collections in new contexts. But these studies have also noted the difficulties that smell raises for conservation and physical, emotional, or cultural difficulties and conflicting responses that smell can elicit from museum patrons. Despite this work and major initiatives, including the Odor project that focused on smell history and heritage in Europe from the 1600s to present, Murray Parker and his colleagues noted in a 2024 literature review on sensory heritage that the difficult issues that smell raises for heritage policy and practice means that it's still relatively understudied compared to the other four senses when it comes to heritage. In the UK, it's an apt time, I think, for us to be thinking carefully about the multi-sensory qualities of heritage. On the 7th of March 2024, the UK ratified the UN Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, and the UK is starting the process of building an umbrella inventory of living heritage and subset individual inventories for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And perhaps that will open up space for us to think about how the senses might be engaged with more in a heritage context. But what does it mean to preserve olfactory heritage in contrast to other forms of intangible heritage? So in the existing UNESCO database, there are different entries, intangible heritage, cultural heritage entries that do talk about smell. So for example, the artisanal knowledge associated with baguette baking or perfume culture in grass, both have some mentions of smell, but smell is not central. The smell is simply a kind of part of a wider entry. This is not; these are not intangible cultural heritage entries that are listing practices of smelling or smells in particular. And I think that focus helps make sense of some of the biases in the work that's been done so far on smell and heritage, which is mainly focused really on what might be regarded as pleasant, deliberately designed or cultivated smells. So perfumes, spices, fragrant plants, the odours of old books are the kinds of things we're talking about. There's two rare exceptions here that I think are really interesting in the literature. One is from Joa Skred and Ben Anderson's research on the working class heritage embodied in the smell of the sulphurous digester cellulose factory in Moss, Norway. And the other is Jorge Otero Pelos's exploration of the smell of the tobacco-stained ceiling of the architect Philip Johnson's glass house. In the former case, whilst many were in agreement with the Norwegian heritage officials' belief that neither the digester nor its odour were deserving of heritage status, some of the workers argued that the smell could and should be preserved. In the latter case, the stale tobacco scent of Johnson's glass house was conserved out of existence, necessitating reconstruction by Otero Pelos and a collaborating perfumer. Conservation and heritage practice was informed by contemporary distaste for the odour of smoking rather than the 1950s acceptance that Philip Johnson would have experienced of the smell of tobacco as part of elite male domesticity. What these examples share, I think, with many of the other instances, though, of heritage smells, more pleasant ones and more problematic ones, I'll just admit somebody else briefly, is that they're often unintentional byproducts of the functioning of a technology or a practice rather than deliberately cultivated sense, like in the case of perfumes, for example. In both of these examples, authorised heritage discourse, practices of conservation have operated to exclude odours judged to be offensive to contemporary sensibilities and therefore not really fitting with the stories that local and national heritage want to tell. But what these examples do share with work on perfumes and spices and old books is that they equate olfactory heritage with the identification of a particular smell that's emitted by an object or a set of objects or a space. And that, in a way, makes the definition of olfactory heritage more simple. It's about locating the material origins of a heritage smell, analysing it, and thereby preserving it. And that ensures, in some ways, a fit between the idea of a heritage smell and heritage policy that emphasises material authenticity. So Natalie Simoneau and Daniel Serre have suggested that sensory heritage has the capacity to recognise the ambient qualities of environments that would otherwise lack the memorial or aesthetic qualities that define monuments and historic buildings. Seen from this perspective, smells are a way of revealing the monumentality of heritage that might otherwise sit out with the forms recognised by heritage policy and discourse. But in this paper, one of the things I want to suggest is that the Glasgow subway undermines our attempt to repackage smell heritage within the boundaries that exist and forces us to think anew about how sensory history might challenge what counts as heritage. This paper distinguishes, I think it's important to say this at the start, between odours as material emanations and smells as the perceptual moments when noses articulate links between odours and meanings. It argues that the odours present within the Glasgow subway have changed quite significantly over time, but the sense that the smell is a unique, historic, and therefore important part of the identity of Glasgow and its inhabitants has remained. And this forces us to reconsider how we define and analyse smell heritage. Rather than residing in particular odours that are worthy of preservation, this paper argues that Glasgow subway is an example of smell heritage in the sense that the idea that the Glasgow subway smell is distinctive has offered a tool for the articulation of identity and community and the city's relationship with its past and future. And in making that claim, I'm also trying to nuance and develop the conceptual toolkit that we use for understanding smell. So a foundational concept in smell studies is smellscape, first popularised in the academic humanities and social sciences by the human geographer Douglas J. Porteous in a 1985 article of that name. Porteous's deployment of smellscape built on the notion of soundscape, developed a decade and a half earlier by Murray Schaffer, and borrowed on some of the, although not all of, Schaffer's concepts. So to quote Porteous directly, he argues that soundscapes consist of sound events, some of which are sound marks, a bit like landmarks. Similarly, smellscapes will involve smell events and smell marks. Eyewitnesses are replaced by ear witnesses and nose witnesses. Visual evidence becomes hearsay and nose say. The heighting of visual perception becomes ear cleaning and nose training. In the thinking of Porteous and subsequent academics who have used the term, often with a quite thin theorisation thereof, the smellscape is the material mix of odours that characterises a particular place. Smell marks, which aren't really even defined by Porteous, except by reference to landmarks, have been described by others as an odour that has distinctive meaning within a specific environmental context. Unlike in sound studies, where the notion of soundscape has been expanded to take in the perceptual habits as well as the material environment, smellscape has seemingly remained quite resolute in its emphasis on the material odours around in the environment. It's mainly been deployed on those terms in geography, urbanism, and historical studies as an analytical framing of the subject matter on which a scholar is focused. They are interested in identifying, describing, and analysing something that is called the smellscape. In translating from Schaffer's soundscape to Porteous' smellscape, though, many things have been lost. One of those is the normative preservationist impulse of Schaffer, who was interested primarily in identifying and protecting elements of the soundscape in the face of the onslaught of modern noise. And the second is some of Schaffer's original conceptual language. While sound mark made the transition to smell mark, even if it wasn't really defined very well, the concept of keynote sounds that Schaffer advanced has not been translated into key smells or its equivalent. And it's the argument of this paper that the smell of the Glasgow subway could be conceptualised, and indeed should be, as both a smell mark but also a key smell. A smell mark, to paraphrase Schaffer by substituting smell for sound, is a community smell which is unique or possesses qualities which make it specially regarded or noticed by the people in that community. A key smell is a smell in reference to which everything else takes on special meaning and which is understood to be archetypical in some way. As already indicated in those definitions, the paper understands smell as something broader than odour, so it's about this articulation of links between odours and practices and memories and identities. And the Glasgow subway smell has been specially regarded by many Glaswegians, but also understood to be an archetypical smell through which the wider world of smell is framed and understood. And it's that distinctiveness and centrality in articulating various forms of identity and relationships with the environment, rather than the odours themselves, I think, that make it an interesting heritage smell. So now we get, finally, to all of the stuff about smells and subways and metros. So, in his 1918 travelogue, the American author Samuel Murray described the smell of the Underground Railway, the tube, the subway, the metro, as a unifying smell common to cities across the Western world. Were a blind person, one familiar with our Underground Railway odours, to sail from New York for Europe, being ignorant of the presence of subways there, and later in London or Paris find himself at the entrance of a tube, he would at once know that he was at the approach of a subway by the presence of the smell, as a similar atmosphere emanates from all of them. Murray wasn't especially clear on what defined that bouquet, but other sources, literary, epistolary, and polemical, suggest a mix of burnt dust, metal, and rubber, along with the smell of human bodies mingled in uncomfortable intimacy. As T.W.H. Crossland put it in his 1905 satire, The Suburbans, This triumph of modern suburbanism forced its users to inhale a mixture of tunnel air, condensing steam, and rank tobacco. There was a trace of the infernal regions in many of these early descriptions of subway smells. The sulphurous, smoky atmosphere of underground railways in the period before electrification elicited many an unfavourable complaint about soot and stink. But despite Murray's claim, it seems that many metro systems across the world did have and continue to have their own distinct odours. In 1902, for example, one article argued that in Paris on a hot day, it is positively refreshing to meet the cool breeze escaping from each station, the air having an odour of clean smelling and not unpleasant disinfectant in place of the stuffy hot smell of the central London railway. As this suggests, the distinctiveness of subway system scents owe their origins to the fact that since the late 19th century, they have been spaces in which engineers and authorities have sought to experiment with systems of ventilation, purification, and even aromatization. After a litany of further complaints about stuffy smells on the central London railway, in 1911 machines were installed to pump ozonised air throughout the stations. Ozone, with its exhilarating effects on respiration and its association with the balmy odours of windswept coasts, mountains and forests, was believed to be both healthy, wrong, and destructive of foul odours. A report in the medical journal The Lancet, a year after the introduction of ozone to central London railway stations, reported that it has already given great satisfaction to the employees on the line who speak of the obvious relief from stuffiness and objectionable odour. The scent even merited a perhaps less enthusiastic poetic response from John Betjeman. In 1960, he recalled his time spent on the Underground during the summers of the late 1910s, and he described how they knew the different railways by their smells and contrasted the City and South lines, which reeked like a changing room, with the Central London Railway, which had an ozone smell, not seaweed-scented ozone from the sea, but something chemical from Birmingham. While Benjamin was less positive in his appraisal, other users of underground railways have been more approving. In the 1960s, a carnation-scented disinfectant, which was one in a long run of such scents used since the 1920s and continuing to be used today in different ways, was deployed on the Parisian metro system. According to some reports, at least a few passengers held their handkerchiefs near the spray nozzles on the rear of the carriages to grab and then take some of the floral scent with them. What distinguishes Glasgow's metro from other examples is that there's been a claim that the smell in the Scottish Underground Railway is both distinctive and to some extent quite consistent over time. In other subway systems, references to smell were often framed in terms of the different deodorizing or disinfecting practices. Where the smells of the infrastructure's materials or the passengers that use it are discussed, they are often framed in terms of negative, enervating qualities associated with modern urban life. But since its opening in 1896, the Glasgow Metro, the third oldest underground rail transport system in Europe, has been regularly associated with a distinctive odour, and that odour has been either celebrated or at the very least lauded as unique. Now, the sources in the archive aren't uniformly attentive to that scent. Instead, discussions of them often emerge at points when it's believed to be under threat or changing. In 2001, for example, an article in the Herald newspaper reported that London was trialling new scented disinfectants on the tube borrowed from Paris's metro system. However, the article calmed anxious Glaswegian readers by adding that the unique age-old scent of the city's clockwork orange will remain aloof from a new attack by spurious aromatherapy.
Will, is it worth telling people why it's called clockwork orange? Because the train is orange and it's very small and it only goes very few number of
steps. It's very cramped.
So it's called by the locals call it clockwork orange,
yeah.
Affectionately, but yeah.
Yeah. Travel has provided another important moment when removal of Glaswegians from their native soil or insertion of tourists into it produced remarks on the distinctive scent. When Glaswegians travelled abroad, some of them took the olfactory memory of the subway with them. In 1937, Sir Hector Hetherington, then the principal of Glasgow University, remarked that while he was away from Glasgow, he had two very simple and sensible images of the city. On the one hand, the sound of Glasgow's accents, and on the other hand, the smell of its subway. By contrast, visitors were apt to comment on the subway atmosphere, when in 1954, a newspaper columnist asked a visiting American friend what he liked best about the city. The reply was, and I'm not going to do an American accent, "It's all been just great, but boy, did I love the smell of your subway." The scent's monumental qualities as a key smell within Glaswegians' understanding of their own city and the wider understandings of smell are suggested by the fact that whenever Glaswegian journalists mentioned anything connected to smell, they immediately reached for a reference to the subway. In 1960, when E.G. Ashton reviewed Eighton Ellis's History of Perfume for the Bulletin, he began with a discussion of smell and memory that invoked the indefinable, unforgettable scent that recalls the glories of the Glasgow subway. In the 1968 article detailing the nascent perfume industry on the Outer Hebridean island of Barra, a writer for the Herald clearly made the connection between Scottish heritage and the subway scent. If an important part of the memory is stationed in the nose, then there is ample scope for a further export drive, taking in the dissemination over as much of the globe as possible of peculiarly Scottish smells. Some might qualify as perfumes, some might not. There is the aroma, for example, of the Glasgow subway, that elusive melange of airlessness, soot, and the bottom of the Clyde, with a distinctive note of diesel oil. They were not the only one to make this suggestion. The journalist and novelist George Fraser, sometime editor at the Herald, reportedly had a plan to immure and make marketable the sweet damp ethos of Buchanan Street Station. If only the smell could be got into an aerosol to sell worldwide to Glasgow folk of the dispersal, it would zip him up $1 million, he believed. In 1969, Alistair Phillips, assistant editor of the Glasgow Herald, reported on a collaboration between International Flavours and Fragrance and the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, in which smells had been developed to accompany the reconstruction of a 19th century immigrant railway side slum flat. As a proud Glaswegian, Phillips went straight for the clockwork orange as an example of a historically significant scent. Some smells are, of course, as inimitable as they are unforgettable, and of these we have found the most nostalgic to be the warm, enveloping, musty exhalation that breathes in a steady zephyr from the entrances to all Glasgow subway stations. The connection that Phillips established between the subway's odours and the reconstruction of scents in a museum was an unintended foreshadowing of the debates that were to erupt in Glasgow's newspapers in the 1970s. By the late 1960s, the Glasgow subway system was in something of a crisis. A report in 1954 suggested that by that point, only around 5% of journeys using public transport in the city were on the subway system. Increased car ownership led to a reliance on private transport, and huge housing development programmes relocated many of the subway's existing users to housing estates on the edge of the city. The number of passengers steadily declined throughout the 70s, from 800,000 a month in 1974 to 300,000 a month in May 1977. Breakdowns were a daily occurrence, and these often led to the service being suspended completely. The original rolling stock was still in use, which, as one commentator put it, rendered the subway almost a piece of industrial archaeology in its own lifetime. That feeling of travelling inside industrial heritage was perhaps added to by the presence of musty organic bacterial odours in the underground tunnels. In his 1935 The Shipbuilders, George Blake's exploration of the worlds of Glasgow's industrial working class included a trip on the subway, where it was described as of high antiquarian interest and smells very strangely of age. By the 1970s, the subway curiously combined the sense of hot, metallic, burnt industrial modernity and the mouldy, musty, organic olfactory patina associated with pastness in churches, libraries, or castles. The expansion of private transport was not without controversy. The 1970s witnessed extensive debate in Glasgow about the building of transport infrastructure, especially proposed inner ring road. On the one hand, pressure groups were keen to emphasise the threat that such developments posed to historical features, but on the other hand, planners struggled to assess and thereby take into account the social and environmental costs, particularly of new roads. Glaswegians, especially their journalists, were arguably therefore sensitised to potential impacts from the modernisation of transport infrastructure. Building on consultation with engineers that started in August 1969, the recommendations for modernising the subway were finally funded in 1974, and the final pre-modernisation rides around the Clockwork Orange took place on May the 29th, 1977. In the lead-up to the closure of the subway for its thorough refurbishment, and spurred by concerns that this would lead to the disappearance of its distinctive smell, a debate erupted in the newspapers about what caused the odour of the subway. This was partly prompted by the announcement that Glasgow's Transport Museum would retain 2 of the 1896 coaches, which had been kept running on the subway from its inception through to its closure for modernisation, and a reconstruction of Merkland Street Station. In an edition of the Sunday Post on the 29th of August 1976, the following call was put to the people of Glasgow. Does anybody have the recipe for a strong, stale smell? If so, Mr. Tony Browning, keeper of the Museum of Transport in Glasgow, would be glad to hear it, because Tony has a rather unusual problem. He plans to rebuild the city's Merkland Street Station within the museum, complete with signs, rails, signals, and 2 of the old 1896 coaches, but he feels that the authentic subway atmosphere can never be complete without the unique smell which has become so familiar to generations of Glaswegians. Tony has a fair idea of the essential ingredients: rusting cast iron, damp, stale soil, electric engines and sweat, but he is appealing for a more exact formula. Two main explanations for the subway smell were offered in the wide range of responses that populated Glasgow's newspapers during the next few years. One to do with the maintenance of the infrastructure, and the other with the geology and earth into which the tunnels had been driven. The first and perhaps most popular was the smell of tar. From its inception in 1896 to its electrification in 1935, the Glasgow subway had been run on a cable system. Two large cables ran around the circuit driven by the subway's own power station. The subway carriages would clamp onto this cable and then release when they arrived at a station. The wires were composed of a hemp core around which metal wire was wound, and their upkeep involved the application of what was known as Archangel or Stockholm tar. Otherwise known as pine tar, this highly odoriferous and sticky substance was produced by applying high heat pressure to pine wood in a closed container. The substance had been used throughout the early modern periods for, among other things, preserving and sealing wood ships. The tarry pine scent was further exacerbated by the materials used by the subways for the subway's rail sleepers. Originally, the track was built using creosoted pine sleepers, the treatment of which would have given off a chemical medicinal smell. In the post-electrification subway that ran from 1935 to 77, the cable disappeared and the original sleepers were exchanged for a mix of untreated hardwood and steel. Tar, as for the pine-based materials more generally, were substances that have long held particular health powers. As Claire Hickman has noted, the scent of pine has long been used to help cure or mitigate respiratory conditions. But where the better off might journey to sanatoria surrounded by pine forests or holiday in Germanic hills, the working classes of Glasgow in the early 1900s had a more local solution. As the Glasgow Herald reported in August 1923, in Glasgow there is a convenient and comfortable substitute for the cure of the whooping cough. Years ago, I heard of womenfolk taking their ailing kiddies for a ride in the subway car. Whether it was the air with its tarry smell or not, I cannot say, but the tour was reported to have beneficial results. With electrification, the practice of taking the air of the subway was already being relocated to a folksy past. In 1940, the Herald recalled the days of the cable where the tarry smell was thought to account for a good deal of the therapeutic effect. But even in the 1970s, many still recalled the supposed health benefits of a trip around the Underground. One writer to the Evening Times recalled being taken on a circumnavigation with his whooping cough-afflicted brother in the 1920s, who subsequently made a remarkable recovery. And the correspondent concluded there must be some truth in saying that the smell was a cure. Tar was a consistent keynote in description of the Glasgow subway smell during the 1970s still. Recollections even went so far as to suggest local linguistic innovation. One A. Johnson of Castle Douglas wrote to the Sunday Post in September 1976 that in the 20s, I travelled in the subway morning, noon and night from Shields Road to St Enoch's. The pong was then very strong. One wee Glasgow lassie was heard to say, and this is all one word, Wittitari ropey smell. Some respondents argue that the tarry smell of the pre-electrification subway may have remained. For example, a letter to the Evening Times in 1976 recalled the use of Archangel tar and added, over the years the smell has become less pungent and we're left with the present subway smell, so it's like a kind of diluted form. Others were more sceptical. Vic Palowski, a station master at Hillhead and then Lawrence Street, experienced the pre-modernisation subway, but was also handed stories down by old-timers who remembered the pre-electrification days. In 1987, he retired and told an interviewer that the old subway had a special smell. It was this mix of Archangel tar and water. We got rid of the smells in the new subway. The foundations were completely renewed with 4 or 5 feet of concrete, and the water now is more efficiently drained off. Polowski's memory suggests the way in which the subway smell was part of an oral tradition by which olfactory memories were handed down. The BBC documentary series Current Account, covering the modernisation of the subway in an episode from May 1977, presented by Kenneth Cargill, had an interview, which is the bit that's on the slide here, in which one of the workers reflected, it seems to have grown in strength, the myth that the air from the subway has healing properties. Since 1936, there's been no Archangel tar, but nevertheless, mothers are still taking their children to the top of the stairs to sniff what isn't really there. Whether the smell survived or not, this suggests that the folk belief in the therapeutic qualities of the subway air continued. Those who wrote to the newspapers even suggested some curatorial interventions to recapture the original smell. Alex Reed of Barhead wrote to the Herald in July 1976, saying that he had recently been on a motor cruiser on the Clyde, and that there he found the almost forgotten smell of the subway. He'd picked up a length of tar-soaked rope to use as warp, and the scent had immediately hit him. Might, Reed therefore suggested, the curators go to the nearest ship chandlers, obtain a length of rope soaked in Stockholm tar, and use it as a handrail in the recreated station. The survival of the widely held ideas about the subway's tarry smell were bound up with folk and lay medical ideas about air, odour and respiratory health. And olfactory heritage has tended to focus on the smells of books, perfumes, and buildings. Passed down as an oral tradition and remembered by those who had gone on therapeutic visits to the subway tunnels as children, the example illustrates the importance of lay ideas about health and smell to forms of olfactory heritage. But there were also other attempts to recreate the smell. And this brings us to the second explanation for the subway scent, a mix of earth, damp, bacteria, and the leaking water from the Clyde that produced the unique atmosphere of Glasgow's tunnels. One of the respondents to the Herald's investigations argued that the scent was that musty smell you get from turning earth. Other writers followed with similarly chthonic characterizations. Carol McNeill reflected on the strange mixture of Middle Earth atmosphere. William Hunter described the sweet damp smell of Buchanan Street Station, and James McTavish described the odour as a mix of dampness and the niff from the electrics. This idea seems to suggest the scent of the subway was rooted in Glasgow's soil, a kind of olfactory terroir. As another article from May 1978 puts it, the damp underground wall provided an ideal breeding ground for certain kinds of bacteria, which combined to provide whiffs of a smell which could be truly said to belong to Glasgow. Having recognised the smell might be bound up with the unique bacterial mix present in the tunnels, the expertise of the biochemist Elliot Simpson was enlisted, pictured here, participating in that 1977 documentary. Trained at Dundee University, Simpson had a theory about where the smell came from. He noted that compared to the London Underground, the Glasgow subway offered very little space between the carriages and the tunnels, which allowed smells to accumulate. And he thought the smell was similar to one he'd encountered when sniffing a tube carrying an actinomyces culture. He detected the same smell in the stone-walled chapel of Church's House in Dunblane. Simpson was invited to appear in the BBC documentary, which showed him collecting some samples of mud and water from the trickling stream between the tracks, which he then took back to the lab and cultured. Simpson's conclusion in the documentary was, it's probably Streptomyces, but there are several of those, and again, each one has its own smells. It could just be a special one for the Glasgow Underground that isn't in any other. Offered the resulting bacteria to sniff on camera, the Transport Museum's Tony Browning thought that it was pretty near it, but I'd like to see a little more oily tar smell injected. In fact, Browning had rather patronisingly admitted in the documentary that he thought the whole smell thing was a bit of a joke started by the mischievous journalist who had written the piece in the Sunday Post. In the late 1970s and 80s, this was a period when Glasgow's museums were busy trying to project a post-industrial vision of the city as a cultural capital. So perhaps in this context, a focus on underground odours seemed somewhat lowbrow to Browning and his Glasgow Museum's colleagues. But as the responses showed, Glaswegians' appreciation of the subway smell was quite serious. That native Glaswegians valued the smell more than others is suggested also by a further piece published in the Sunday Times in March 1977, so an English newspaper. A member of the Department of the Environment who was interviewed on the subject of the smell lowered his voice and told the English reporter that, I must preface my remarks by reminding you that I am surrounded by bona fide Glaswegians who hold this smell in great esteem. Being from the suburbs, I do not regard it with the same reverence. Many here would describe it as an attractive smell, but for me it is a damp, musty, oily, diesely pong. At the Transport Museum, interviewing an unnamed individual who may well have been Tony Browning, the reporter was then told that while some compared the odour to newly ploughed virgin soil at springtime, the anonymous official felt the smell was down to the bodies of Glaswegians themselves and therefore would remain long after modernisation. Yeah, bloody English people, eh? In documentary films, there are also some, though admittedly not many, indications of the wider smellscape that was lost because of refurbishment. As part of modernisation, many buildings surrounding existing or new stations were being demolished and their owners moved outwards from the centre of Glasgow. The documentary film from 1977 interviewed the owner of J. McKechnie and Son Butchers and Fishmongers. Located right next to the subway's West Street station, the staff at the stations down the line claimed to be always able to smell when fish were being smoked at the premises because the scent travelled into the subway and down through the tunnels. As Peter, the then owner added, every time he knew without fail, he said he could smell the slight smell in the tunnel. Similarly, Cliff Hanley, the Glaswegian novelist and broadcaster, who had even written a song about the Glasgow subway, which I will not be playing, noted in the documentary that as one travelled under the Clyde, the leaks in the tunnel created a particular smell that functioned as an olfactory barrier between the north side and the south side. What was being potentially lost was not just the smell of the subway, but the olfactory relationship between the subway and the city that it travelled through. Indeed, there was something telling about Hanley's comments in another documentary covering the modernisation that was filmed between 1977 and 1980. The narrator described how, at each street-level entrance there lingered the authentic trademark of the subway smell, an indefinable, not unpleasant mustiness. Hanley then appeared as a talking head and added that the smell is still a great Glasgow legend. It varies from station to station. At Calvin Bridge, it was a kind of mixture of old steam and old dust, a bit like wash day in a slum, but pleasant with it. Ever the poet, Hanley had made an olfactory connection, a kind of smell rhyme and echo between two processes that were occurring in parallel. On the one hand, the clearance of Glasgow's slum housing and the removal of tenants to housing estates on the city fringes, and on the other hand, the modernisation of Glasgow's subway system. As Ada Kearns and Lynn Abrams have shown, the smells of communal cleaning and washing the halls that were found in tenements continued to haunt many of the new blocks of flats into which many Glaswegians were rehoused. Similarly, when the subway reopened, at least a few attentive noses claimed that the smell of the Clockwork Orange had resisted modernisation. Jack House for the Evening Times walked into the new subway and cried, "But nay, smell! As I walked down the stairs, I felt disappointed not to be welcomed by that nostalgic effluvia. But as he journeyed around the subway, coming to Cowcaddens, he thought he got a wonderful whiff of the subway smell, and he breathed deeply, feeling that a bit of Glasgow had come back to him." Several other people wrote to the Herald and the Evening Times, suggesting that a good sniff uncovered the old smell from beneath £58 million of plastic. So perhaps the smell hadn't disappeared. Now, references to Glasgow's slum clearance and housing estates are connected to its subway through another smell, hydrogen sulfide. One of the dominant notes in the more recent descriptions of the subway's Buchanan Street station, as well as the lower level at Queen Street station, which predates the subway, is that of rotten eggs. And that's where the history of the subway connects with another Glasgow smell mark, the Stinky Ocean. The ocean was a product of waste from the St Rollock's chemical works that accumulated north of the factory from the end of the 18th century to the 1960s, when the business wound up. The solid refuse from the factory was made up of oxysulfide of calcium, which reacted with the smoky, polluted air from surrounding industries to produce sulfide of calcium, which then, when it rained, washed down into a bog-like lake, and from then along the Pinxton Burn into the Kelvin, and from the 1860s onwards through a pipe that also discharged the waste into the Clyde at the end of Dixon Street. I did have a lovely map pointing this all out, but I've lost it, so I didn't have time to remake it, so I apologise. The waste from the St Rollock's plant therefore had an uncertain and somewhat tentacular geography that stretched southward from the Stinky Ocean proper, which was located to the north of the works, via pipes, burns, and it appears railway tunnels. Crucially, the waste site was located between the entrances to two of the chief railway lines that entered the centre of Glasgow from the north, the North British and Caledonian Railways, which upon entering the tunnels continued onto Queen Street and Buchanan Street stations respectively. The government's annual Alkali Inspector's report from 1883 noted that the smell of sulphuretted hydrogen is frequently very bad, especially on the North British side, where the process of oxidation is going on from the fresh deposits which have been extended close to the line. And as upwards of 10,000 people pass this spot daily, the nuisance is not likely to be forgotten. Various news reports and forum discussions from nostalgic Glaswegians and rail enthusiasts have suggested that the sulphuric odour perceivable at the lower level of Queen Street and in the Buchanan Street subway station is due to their proximity to the waste from the Stinky Ocean. Already adjacent to the existing railway tunnels, since the 60s, the area of the Stinky Ocean has been constantly churned up by the redevelopment of the railways and the building in the 60s, demolishing in the early 2000s, and then rebuilding of housing on the site and its immediately adjacent land in Sightshill, or what's known to some Glaswegians as Shiteshill. The tunnels soaked up some of these odours, which had percolated outward in the air and water from the St Rollock's plant. In a fascinating article on the smell of railways from 1975, Derek Cross noted that tunnels held the richest reflections for the connoisseur of railway smells, and especially those adjacent to large terminal stations. And one of Cross's examples was the tunnel leading to Glasgow's Queen Street, which he characterised as a formidable place with a formidable odour that evoked sewage, salted by stale smoke, and a liberal dose of suppurating shellfish. Rotten, slightly acrid, Cross was describing the smell of hydrogen sulfide that leaked from the Stinky Ocean's permeable coastline and into the surrounding soils of North Glasgow. Both the St Rollock's plant's waste and the subway scents are featured in Glasgow's nostalgic romanticisation. Whilst London's Cockneys were those born within the sound of St Mary Le Beau's bells, in 1911 William Power, proud Glaswegian, supporter of the literary Scottish Renaissance of the 1920s, and from 1940 to 42 leader of the Scottish National Party, asserted that the man who has been reared within the smell of St Rollock's is a citizen of Glasgow in the first place, a Scotsman in the second, and a Briton in the third. Indeed, if today one looks through Facebook pages dedicated to photographs of Glasgow's history, you're sure to find plenty of people commenting on pictures of St Rollock's and its environs and nostalgically remembering the smell of the Stinky Ocean. Douglas Stewart, a child of the Sighthill estate, recalls a rich and varied smellscape in his novel of post-industrial Glasgow, Childhood, Shuggy Bane. from adult male sweat, lanolly tweed, or sour stout on the breath, to stale piss on footbridges, burning coal from housing estates, and ubiquitous car exhaust fumes. In a 2022 essay reflecting on his early years, Stewart recalled that in the 80s he spent most of my days exploring empty factories or playing by the Stinky Ocean, the sulphurous shipping canal that had been polluted by chemical effluent. In the post-war decades, a raft of novels and memoirs emerged that seemed to sanitise and celebrate the poverty of Glasgow's working classes, and newspapers also published fond remembrances of the Stinky Ocean. In March 1980, a mother wrote to the Evening Times asking them to confirm the story she'd been telling her son about her childhood playing in the cesspit. In April of the same year, the Times published a letter from W.J. Thomas recalling growing up around Port Dundas and playing in the waste-scarred landscape until their sister Betty fell into the Stinky Ocean and emerged pogging worse than a barrel of rotten eggs. In 1989, the Evening Times, in a piece on memories of Glasgow, again, we have these memories of people playing in it. However, that also led to a lively critique of the romanticisation of Glasgow's polluted past. In an article from 1984, Jack Maclean, longtime writer for the Herald, attacked novels that deployed what he referred to as the picturesque shadows that created the charming Cheshire, pronounce that wrong, of Scottish urban class consciousness, as the cult of the Sugarolly water, the Sugarolly mountains, the Stinky Ocean, the Auchenshugul tram. It's Glasgow-philia, it is ethnocentric elitism without the decency of a reason to it. And indeed, in a 1983 novel by one of the authors that Maclean accused of the equivalent of poverty porn, Margaret Thomas Davis, one character enters the subway's Byres Road station and then is described as smelling the earthy smell sucked up from the subway. Maclean's criticism of the cloying nostalgia that he referred to as Black Sannyism resonated with another controversy over the subway. Basically, in 1982, the Glasgow passenger transport executive teams up with Times to get poems to put on the subway, including the first four, which were from Edwin Morgan, that had been around imagined subway animals. And the transport executive had a massive sense of humour failure and said, no, we're not going to put these up, they're ridiculous. And one of the kind of part of the response was to say they wanted to get over the over-the-shoulder folksy Glasgow approach. We're all a bit tired of the old subway stories where the mothers take their kids down and cure them of the whooping cough. So, as in the case of Maclean's critique of the Stinky Ocean nostalgia, the smell of the subway was seen by Glasgow's modernising-minded officials as part of the past that the city sought to move on from as it sugarled its way through the 1980s. However, we still see plenty of people kind of lamenting that the smell was disappearing, lamenting that the smell might disappear. While transport infrastructure tends not to attract many reviews on TripAdvisor, as museums or eateries, it's notable that a handful of the 156 reviews of the Clockwork Orange mention smell, and those that do are by Glaswegians. One such reviewer commented in 2017 that he loved the old familiar smell, not an unpleasant one, while in 2020 somebody mused, I love the smell of the subway too, takes me back to my childhood, but there's something about the damp aroma evocative and comforting. Confirming the impression of consistency, an Aberdeen-dwelling Glaswegian expatriate noted in 2017, I travelled a lot on the subway 50 years ago and it still smells the same. We can also find these kinds of reminiscences on the web elsewhere. So this is a YouTube video by the train enthusiast David Ramsey showing off the Glasgow subway's new trains in December 2023. The video has 75,354 views, but the top voted comment from another Glasgow-based user is telling. I didn't think it was possible to smell a video, but as a Glaswegian, I instantly got the subway smell as soon as you showed the platform. Among the replies to this comment, we find people describing the scent as so nostalgic and a lament from somebody who moved to London only to find that tube stations don't have that Glasgow subway smell. Whilst there are suggestions that the smell survived in situ, the museum experience of the subway smell was one of absence or pure imagination. Elements, as I said, of the pre-modernisation subway system can be found in what was the Pollock Shields, then Kelvin Hall, and now Riverside Museum of Transport and Travel. A letter to the Evening Times in October 1981, once the museum display was installed at Kelvin Hall, said, I was delighted to see the old subway train displayed in the Transport Museum. It brought back such memories. A pity they couldn't recapture the famous subway smell to add to the realism. Similarly, a 1984 Glasgow Herald piece celebrating 20 years of the city's Transport Museum noted that the Merkland Street station was less than a complete rebuilding, being without that subway smell. Fast forward to the Contemporary Transport Museum at the Riverside location, and the TripAdvisor reviews here are telling. A number bemoan the lack of the smell from the subway, but also the lack of smell of oil and grease that characterised the Kelvin Hall Museum. And it's really interesting that whilst there is no mention of the Glasgow subway smell in their recreation, not even like a reference to it, there is one place in which the museum mentions smell, and it's on Main Street, where we've got horses pulling a tram, which says Glasgow stank, each day thousands of horses defecated onto the city streets. So rather than choosing to articulate the significance of a meaningful, unique smell, the curation has chosen to highlight a toilet training view of the past common in so many other museum uses of smell, in which the odours of the past only matter to the extent that they offer a filthy contrast with the clean and pleasant land of modernity. Despite no smells being explicitly distributed in the Riverside version of the subway, it's interesting that there are 2 reviews on TripAdvisor that basically claim that they can smell the old subway smell when they go into the exhibit. Which suggests that even where the smells were no longer present, for some, the physical experience of stepping into the subway carriages might have triggered vivid memories and a kind of almost hallucinatory experience of olfactory heritage. For others who visit the museum, such as Ruth Wishart, who wrote a piece on it in 1994, visiting the museum led them to reflect on the fact that the current clockwork orange subway hasn't got the smell right still, and that they need to kind of rejuvenate the smell within the subway itself. Similarly, Facebook, Glasgow City Archive posts images of the Glasgow subway sometimes, and you get all of these comments that are like, the smell, right? So, the smell of Glasgow subway, I think, is an important example of intangible and tangible cultural heritage. On the one hand, the smell of the subway is a monument of physical presence that has been transmitted intergenerationally, perhaps largely unintentionally. On the other hand, the ability to identify and appreciate the subway smell, celebrated by some Glaswegians over the course of the last 100 years, might be regarded as a kind of intangible heritage practice that connects Glasgow's history with its present, contributes to local identity, that is recognised as significant and has often been the focus of concerns about preservation. And I think it's telling that whenever now we get, like, in the post-modernisation period, whenever you've got discussions of kind of heritage smells, they'd still invoke the smell of the Glasgow subway. This is a quote from a discussion of the revamped Citizens Theatre, in which they smell like the Glasgow subway smell. The smell has kind of disappeared. There's an interview in 1994 with nutters, who are the people who, as they're known, who are the people who love Glasgow's paddle steamers, and they describe the smell as being addictive, like the smell of the Glasgow subway. So it's constantly kind of referred back to. That's what I mean by it being a kind of archetypical smell. There are questions there about whether it will survive. So 1990s life history data by Colin Pooley and Jean Turnbull suggests that by that point, around 4 to 5% of commuters were using the underground to get to work. And this has gone down in 2011 to around 3% of Glasgow's commuters. We don't have the 2022 census data. So, and interestingly, most of the users are young. So there's also kind of discrepancy there in the kind of the age of the people who are using it, and who will have basically mostly been born after the electrification, and certainly, but also after modernisation. And I think it's really interesting. I think one of the conclusions I want to make in this paper is that the subway smell is different and has been different over time, but the idea that there's a distinctive smell has remained. And this is quite revealing. This is from when it reopens in 1980 by Sally Magnuson, writing for The Scotsman, who went on the first trip around the subway with Mr. Campbell Douglas, who was 87 and who had ridden on the first ever circuit of the subway when it opened in 1896, when he was just 4 years old. He subsequently commuted on it around Glasgow throughout his teenage and adult life. Riding the new subway for the first time in April 1980, his only regret was the absence of that lovely smell. Magnuson, who was young enough to have never ridden on the pre-electrification subway, then added, "The smell hasn't gone completely. There's just a whiff of that indefinable subway aroma to remind you of what you're missing. Nobody has ever worked out what caused the subway smell. Some say the sparks, some say the moss in the tunnel, but wherever it came from, there's not much of it left now." But what if Campbell and Magnuson were not in fact describing the same smell? Might Campbell's lament be for the tarry smell of the pre-electrification days, whilst Magnuson was sniffing for the damper, earthier scent of the electrified subway? The Glasgow subway smell was a different heritage smell, though frequently interpreted as unique and special for each generation. And that explains why across the period, particularly from the 1930s to the present, the Glasgow subway smell seems to always be disappearing, whilst it remains consistent in other sources. In conclusion then, this paper is thought to show the Glasgow subway smell can be conceptualised as a heritage smell that's a smell mark and a key smell. The story of Glasgow's subway smell is about the survival of a heritage smell, despite the tendency of institutions and authorised heritage discourses to undermine or ignore it. It survived despite the disparaging and patronising attitudes of some museum workers towards the scent. It's been specially regarded by many Glaswegians throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, but more than that, it's been a scent through which Glaswegians have articulated their relationship to smell and identity, by comparing it to other heritage and historical smells, by relating it to the city history of pollution and poverty, and by figuring the city's ongoing modernisation and transformation in terms of its impact on the Glasgow subway smell. What's important here is not precisely what the Glasgow subway smells of, which has changed over time, but rather the perception that it has a distinctive smell that mediates the relationship between Glasgow's past, present, and future.